Hello and welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Uhler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Last time on the show, Dr. Linda Blade was with us and Dr. Ann Gillies, plus John Uhler, all discussing, well, unsporting. Let's just put it that way. Unsporting. What's happening with the trans movement in sports is concerning to a lot of people out there, moms, dads, grandparents, and the players alike. Let's bring in John, Dr. Ann, and Dr. Linda all right now together in one. Thank you all for being here today. John, let's start with you today. I know on our last program, we talked about a lot of stuff. We got into the coaching side of things when I got to kind of inject and add a few things. But there was a lot more to that 1 hour session. So why don't you do a recap real quick and introduce Dr. Ann and Dr. Linda, and you guys can run with it from there.
Brad, I appreciate it. And I encourage anyone, if you've not seen part one, please do that, because there was a lot discussed. I learned a lot. I am not a coach. And so to think that we have two coaches on screen with us on the program, and male and female perspective as far as coaching, it was very informative. And I know Dr. Ann Gillies, who's with us, my capable co-host. I'm so appreciative, Ann. My guess is you were learning a lot too, and we are now going to make a shift to really we talked about some of the very practical things that coaches have to deal with, but we're going to also now start to talk about the serious topic of safety. But Dr. Ann Gillies, welcome. And do you want to kind of give your thoughts on what we heard last time, and then we'll introduce Linda Blade officially?
That's wonderful, John. Thank you for having me. Yes, the last episode was very enlightening. Linda, I really enjoyed what you were saying. Well, let me qualify that. I didn't enjoy it at all. You know, I'm sad that we have to deal with this, and I am really sad that that in the athletic world, in the sports world, that you have to deal with the things that you were talking about. So Dr. Linda, you have a PhD in kinesiology. You understand physiology, biology. You come from a really great perspective to be addressing this in Canada right now. And you've also just written a book. Well, 2019, right? You wrote this book.
2021.
Oh, okay. I had that wrong. Oh, because you were just kind of getting into
Yes.
Okay, 21. And the name of the book. Can you put it up again, John? Because I think that is.
I will bring it up right now.
Unsporting.
That's right.
It's Unsporting, and the title is there. Unsporting: How Transactivism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. And I wrote it with Barbara Kay, the journalist.
And I love it. The title is so informative itself, because what you're addressing isn't the individuals. It's not the children. We're not attacking or trying to target anyone, but we are exposing activism, trans activism, cross-sex activism, gender activism. And then the other piece is science denial, which is something that I like to talk about. But you really have nailed it with this title. And when you talked last time, I mean, I just have my eyes wide open to what's happening in the sports realm, and it's very concerning. And Brad talked about what's happening on the volunteer basis. You talked about that. I think that's tremendous, because, you know, it is athletics and sports, children's sports. We as parents love to get our kids involved from very young ages, but it takes a lot of hands on deck, and it's the parents, usually grandparents, that are volunteering. And as we heard, volunteers are going, I don't want to deal with this trans stuff here. Why do we have to do that? And from a coaching perspective, having coaches have to sign this trans activism document is absolutely destroying. I think it's destroying the whole sport itself. So anyways, there we go. So now we're moving into this whole area of predation, which actually is also John's area of expertise. And I think this is where we need to go. Some of the concerns you have, Dr. Lindo, tell me what you think is on the horizon, and kind of where your greatest concerns are in this whole movement for athletics.
Well, as I mentioned in part one, the first part of my concern is clearly what happens on the field, the unfairness of somebody crossing the sex-based boundary. It's just no different than if somebody, let's say a 20-year-old was competing with a 12-year-old. If you cross the age boundary, you cross the sex boundary. There is a reality-based system in sport where we understand that stratification, if you stratify by age and sex, you're going to keep things a level playing field. If the minute you stray from that, it's going to be unfair and probably unsafe for certain people. But then beyond that, I've often argued with my in the policy debates that the unsafety, the lack of safety goes beyond, lack of safety goes into the things like bathrooms, locker rooms, a male person self-identifying as a woman to chaperone little children. And I know it's not prevalent. It's not a huge amount of people. As Brad said last time, it's maybe 1 or 2% of the population. But I think what I need to understand as a sports administrator, because I am president of Athletics Alberta, which is the track and field association for the province of Alberta. And what we're contending with is policy or guidelines that will help to keep things safe within this new environment. And I think part of what I've noticed and part of what sort of caught my attention in terms of your program, Unmasking the Trans Movement, and I've seen now that there is sort of there's a subset perhaps of this group, of this ideology that is malicious in intent. I worry about that. How do we know the difference between somebody who's really benign and somebody who has a very evil intent? I don't know how we're asking coaches to be able to discern between administrators to discern. And part of how we get to that point is to understand two things. Where is it coming from? Like what is the background of these people if they have malintent? And then what is it that we should do about it as sports administrators? And
you have to be a
I'm
mental
seeing.
health professional right now to coach, it seems. And that's the real issue here that I've got with sports. This was supposed to be about engaging kids and having fun. Remember, fun, F-U-N, number one thing at the top of the list, Hockey Canada?
Exactly.
It wasn't transgender ideology, I'll tell you that.
Exactly. So that's what I'm looking for. John and Anne, I'd let you take that away because I am here ready to learn from you on this.
Well, and again, Linda, you are an expert in the field of athletics as far as coaching, as far as being placed in a position to influence policy. And therefore, that is your concern. You've been asked on both the provincial as well as the federal level in Canada to give your feedback. And what you told us is your feedback has pretty much been sort of minimized as far as the concerns you raise. So there are very practical concerns. What do you do in the locker rooms? And then you also raise, what about chaperone situations when you have minors, when you have these men that all of a sudden have quote unquote self-identified? And then that does bring up certainly the issue of safety, and that is a big part of our concern here on Unmasking the Trans Movement, because as we say, that we are not anti any group of people. We are for the protection of women and children and against anything that would enable the exploitation, whether financially. So we see that through the moving sidewalk on the trans movement, where you have not just the social transitioning, but then the medicalization. So those that are going to push big pharma on these kids and create customers for life, patients for life, and then the doctors that are fast tracking them, and the surgeons, because the moving sidewalk of the trans movement moves them out, eventually dumping them onto a surgeon's gurney where they will have their sex organs amputated. That doesn't help anyone, right? So we're here to help and not to, we're ultimately to do no harm in the mental health field and the medical realm. Now we're talking about the sports field, and our concern, a significant degree of concern, is that not only is the trans movement and all things trans making it so that trauma is being compounded, because you have a number of, if not a significant majority of those that are within the trans movement, they have had their sexual boundaries crossed, if not outright exploited and abused. You also have a high degree of a number of the young people are on the autism spectrum, both populations, sexual abuse survivors and those on the autism spectrum have one thing in common, and that is they have a very difficult time with their intuition, which is their reality testing, which helps them know that they know whether or not their emotional and physical boundaries have been crossed. Every perpetrator must overcome their intended target of opportunities, resistance. They have to overcome their boundaries. A predator has no conscience, and therefore the only thing left to stop them is our boundaries. Now, what does that have to do with this? In order to understand how best to keep people safe, especially women and children, you need to understand the mind of a predator. You need to understand how they operate and their methods and motives. If people think that anybody that self-identifies, especially a male in terms of XY chromosome, if you believe that any male that wants to quote unquote transition does so out of the best of intentions, then you are dangerously naive. Why? Because how do you know, and evidence is to the contrary, that you have very sexually deviant individuals that have made their way into the population of the trans movement, as a matter of fact, second only to churches, in my estimation. So predators will go wherever there is a large pool of vulnerable individuals. And one of the things they look for are those that are very believing, very trusting. So where are you going to find those two kinds of populations? You're going to find them in faith-based organizations or faith-based communities where we want to believe, and that's another thing. Predators know us better than we know them, and they know that people who want to believe the best, and that's actually a normal person, by the way, right? None of us want to be jaded. None of us want to be suspicious, but we need to be discerning. And the question is, do we believe there's such a thing as a sexual predator with morals? Okay. Do we believe there's a sexual predator with scruples? Could we ever fathom or think about the possibility that we might actually have an immoral sexual predator? Okay. I think we all, yeah, okay. You don't have one, right? How about this? Can you ever imagine there might be a sexual predator who might be unethical? Probably. All right. How about a sexual predator that is unscrupulous? How about a sexual predator that would lie to your face? I can't believe they would actually do that. I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. 100% of them prior to arrest are lying to your face, right? Yeah. And then after arrest, first of all, I didn't do it. Wasn't my stuff. I don't know how that got on my computer, all that. They are the world's greatest liars. By the time somebody is offending sexually, they have morphed into the realm of sexual psychopathy. So there are three primary factors when it comes to a psychopath, and this is germane or pertinent to this discussion. The number one thing is they have no conscience. What can someone without a conscience do? The answer, anything.
A lot of things.
I can do anything. Yeah. Why doesn't the average person take advantage of someone? Well, because we've got a conscience. There you go. Ethics and morals. If you dispense with your conscience, if you override your conscience, if you cause it to be calloused enough, if you cauterize it enough, if you override it, you will. And we that have a conscience, we think, oh my gosh, how could you sleep at night? Well, that's because you're asking from a frame of reference or perspective that you have a conscience. But if you didn't have a conscience, I'll tell you how you would sleep. Perfectly. Now, I'm not advocating for this. It's not normal. It's really warped. But if your conscience doesn't bother you, how do you sleep? Just fine. And that's why those of us with a conscience say, how can he live with himself when he does that? How can he sleep at night? Oh, he lives with himself very well and he sleeps very well at night. Why? Because nothing bothers him. We have to understand that you can actually get to a point where you've so overridden your conscience that you aren't bothered by anything anymore. But that's not the only thing that happens. When someone is progressing into selfishness, as their overriding conscience, so ego's going up, conscience is going down. Instead of my value of people having a high value of people, I start to have a higher value of myself. And by virtue of that, in that equation, my estimation of me goes up and my estimation of you goes down. And therefore, I can rationalize and justify, because things are happening inside of me, that you are no longer to be loved as a person and treated as a person, valued and esteemed. You are there for my benefit and to be used. We call that the process of objectification. I can be a financial objectifier. You come onto the car lot that I have, trust me, you are a dollar sign. I'm financially objectifying you. If I want your body parts, I'm going to sexually objectify you. Oftentimes those go together. Where do you find the greatest pool of psychopaths? And there's two kinds of psychopaths, by the way, and this is important to understand for purposes of analysis of this. There are two kinds. The first that comes to mind for all of us, that would be the Freddy Krueger horror movie psychopath. That would be correct. That is called the bloody psychopath. But they are they're few and far between, and they're caught pretty readily. The ones that are around us and that aren't caught very often are what are called white-collar psychopaths. Dr. Robert Hare out of the University of British Columbia coined the phrase white-collar psychopath. He designed the PCLR, the Hare Psychopathy Checklist. He said if he hadn't studied psychopaths in prison, which he actually didn't work in a prison, but aside from that, he said if he hadn't studied them in prison, he would have studied them on Wall Street. Where's the greatest collection of psychopaths? In politics and finance. Next is in psychology, in the ministry, in education, in sports, in law, in medicine, in every endeavor, wherever there are people. And when somebody becomes a psychopath, it's no longer about getting over on someone. It is about having an effect, a negative effect, having a lifetime negative impact. Now layer that with sex and sexuality. It's no longer about lust and attraction. It is now about having a negative effect. It's about marring, stealing, soiling, and defiling and traumatizing. And they are driven to ensure that they're always crossing boundaries. How does that happen? Stair-step fashion downward. The concern is when a man becomes deviant, which has happened all throughout human history, by the time he becomes deviant, he can use women and children at will, without compunction, without fear of conscience and fear of consequences. You take pornography and the internet and you will supercharge that process. What do we have ever since the 80s now? We have supercharged the process. That's why we read now on an increasing basis in newspapers of 14-year-olds that are raping girls. We never used to have, there's always been, but not at this rate. Well, is it because of reporting mandates? No, actually, a lot of stuff is being swept under the carpet in schools.
That's right.
If you place pornified material in front of young men, you have an impact upon them. And as concerned as we are within Unmasking the Trans movement for the safety of women and children, we are also concerned about the unleashing of the potential unleashing, if not the actual unleashing of sexual psychopaths. At what age, how young can someone become a sexual psychopath? I would say probably as early as age 10.
Really?
Age 12. Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. Have you ever heard of a 12-year-old that starts raping, and by the time he's 15, he's finally busted, and the victims come out of the woodwork at that time?
Wow. Never heard of it.
We call that juvenile sex offending, and they go into a program in residential treatment, juvenile sex offenders. Mm-hmm. By the time a young man is in sex offender treatment at age 16, the success rate is still pretty low. Why? Because he's been doing this for years.
That's right.
Even at age 16. That's what we have unleashed. What happens as a young man becomes deviant? I'm going to now share the screen because people need to understand this, because the question is, would there ever be an inclination on the part of a sexual deviant male to want to gain access to women or girls in a shower room or a locker room or a changing room? Used to be used to have to climb trees and peek in windows. Now they can do what? Would a sexual psychopath ever think about dressing in women's underwear and drag and makeup, or putting on a women's swimsuit to gain access to the locker rooms? What I ask you is this: are you kidding me? What would the men in my sex offender treatment groups say? I have 3 groups totaling about 45 men right now, ready to start a 4th group. I'm a certified sex offender treatment provider. I am certified in the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, been doing sex offender treatment, working with sex offenders for 14 years thus far. 11 of those were in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Here's the progression into deviance. It starts with where every man is at, every young man's battle. This is why we do not need to help the process, and I use that term loosely. Okay, young men, we are visually oriented, males are. The prolonged attraction and emotional pull that is there, that does not make a young man or a man deviant thus far, but he's going to start to be pulled in. Then he's going to start to leave himself open to temptation. If anybody's familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba, that's where we're at. He left himself open. He had no personal firewall. And what happened? If anybody's familiar with the story, you had David and Bathsheba, and that resulted in the death of David's best friend, who was the husband of Bathsheba. Bad things happen at category 2. But category 3 now is, and look at what we've introduced since photographs. Okay, now we have stuff being delivered to the home. And this is now the young man or the adult who is now actively allowing himself to access material. The joke among men is what? And it's not just a joke among men. As far as Sports Illustrated, what's the most widely accessed edition or most anticipated edition that comes out in Sports Illustrated? It is the swimsuit edition. And most recently, they featured who? Now we have the deviant cross-dressing men that dress as women. Very dangerous in the sense that people don't understand that by the time a man is accessing, or by the time any man dresses in women's underwear and drag, he has consumed hundreds, likely thousands of hours of pornography. People need to understand that. The next progression is into now pornography. It used to be Playboy. Ted Bundy said he started with the likes of a Playboy. Now, does that mean every young man or every man that starts to look at a Playboy will end up like a Ted Bundy? No. But I can tell you 2 things. One is the man will never be the same. He's not becoming a better person, less selfish. And you don't know whether or not there is a Ted Bundy that's accessing this material. And do we really want to risk it? Now we progress from there. He's going to seek out. Now there's this active seeking out. You notice the first 3 categories, he was not actively seeking out. Now something grabs hold of him and he's going to begin to change. He doesn't have the brakes on anymore. This is now, we could call sex addiction. But sex addiction does not automatically lead to offending, and someone who is an offender did not necessarily get into sex addiction. It's kind of interesting. How do you determine the difference? To what extent did the person attempt to put the brakes on? There are certain individuals that never attempted to put the brakes on. I've worked with many of them. Again, we're now to the fifth category. We're seeking out graphic, sexually stimulating, and explicit material. And then we transition to what? This should make everybody uncomfortable. Sexually exploitive or degrading. This is the BDSM. This is what we call pansexuality, erotica, and what? 50 Shades of Grey, which is now considered entertainment at Walmart. Look at what's happened to our society. So this is computer simulated alter egos. If anybody's familiar now with furries, this is where we're into, and that's why the most deviant group out there that I want to warn parents about are furries, because furries are an anthropomorphic and animal-like, these are big costumes, but this is really, in my estimation, the most dangerous activity for minors to involve themselves in, because it's all the adults have 100% of their identity covered. Now we're going to move into, and this is where it splits between adult versus a man that continues downward into child pornography. But now it's manipulation, exploitation, and degradation. That is important because morally, the person is going downhill now at a progressive rate. This is when you get into the BDSM. You can see some of the, I'll just read it, sexual degradation and violence. This is where you also get in the criminal detectives. A large number of men, when I was heading up treatment in the 65-bed standalone unit, it was for a high-intensity sexual offender treatment for sexually violent predators. It was unbelievable for me to walk up and down the aisles of their cubicles that they slept in, and to find some of them reading what? I couldn't believe it. They're reading these detective novels. They weren't prohibited from reading them. I look at one of the covers, and it was a woman being grabbed by the throat, held underwater in a bathtub. That should concern a lot of us. We get into bestiality at this point. As far as the men do, they're starting to watch that. And at the bottom, bribes and secrets are used to gain the victim's silence, usually the kids at that point. We're moving now in terms of severity of what the content is. Calculated sexual rape and use of children for purposes. Now you can have a split right there. And my contention is this. No man, it is a deceptive lie to say somebody was always attracted to children. First of all, nobody's attracted to a child's body. And secondly, that is a lie. Where did we hear that from? From the mouths of the world's greatest liars, the inmates themselves. They start with the pornography that has adult women in it and progress downward. Okay. If they don't stop at what's called barely legal, they will continue downward, and they progress through these stages: personal power, control, then it gets into sexual deviance. The person is becoming warped by that time. They're no longer becoming normal any longer, and a psychopath, layer sexuality on top of that, you have a sexual psychopath. Their brains, their minds are actually different at that point. Porn will change the brain as well. I'll continue. They're in it for profit, different reasons why, including this is where they will sell pictures, upload and download, ego satisfaction, and having defrauded their innocence. That's very important to understand, because they are driven to defraud and to defile and to traumatize. So if they can go into a private space of a woman and the woman can't do anything about it and has to just sit there, would a deviant guy ever think about going into that kind of private space? 100% yes. Would he get an erection? Yes. Would a guy on the far left get an erection? No. Why? Because he cares. It's still there on the far left, strangely enough. It's still about mood, and he cares about how someone feels. So the men on the left are accessing that. A woman can, quote unquote, ruin the mood, meaning he won't be able to get an erection. A deviant man can only get an erection when he knows he's traumatizing a woman. We're on to the far right. So would a man go into a woman's locker room who is deviant in order to watch them and disrobe and get an erection and traumatize them? And now they're supposed to be able to concentrate on their sport, as well as how many women have been sexually abused and sexually exploited. And suddenly you're going to supposedly enhance the ability of women on a sports team to be able to concentrate on what they're supposed to concentrate on. and sexual, but now they're being told to shut up and sit down. That should be familiar, because the kind of pornography they access on the right tells women to shut up and sit down, and I'll put my hand on your throat and I'll strangle you. Silence of the Lambs. Sexual violence against adults. Continuing reading on the second at the bottom chart. Silence is secured by threats of harm or death of the victim and his or her family. That's what they do to kids. But notice the silence. Silence is secured. So now what's happening in the trans movement? Who's being silenced? Women. They're being told to sit down and shut up. The last category, cold and calculated, methodical and strategic raping of the child or adult. Notice how it's calculated, methodical, and strategic. My contention is this: the entire movement to put men in women's sports, men in women's rape shelters, men in women's prisons is all about the traumatizing of women and the opening of doors for deviant men to have their way with these women. Pornography increases the desire to traumatize, and it creates a malevolence within men towards women. I'm going to bring up now another chart, as a matter of fact. Actually, I'll stop sharing. I'll go back to you all now, and then I'm going to bring up another chart. Any questions on that? That's rough to see, but okay. But I simply ask this: can any person listening to me, in the sound of our voices here, can you tell me what one of these men look like?
No.
Correct.
Everyday
Right?
people.
And I can tell you this: the further somebody goes downhill, as far as off the straight and narrow, a man into deviance, he's going to look increasingly freakish. Increasingly, he's going to stand out. That'll be the creepy guy down the street that everybody says, kids, don't go near his home. That's Creepy Joe. Or he'll look increasingly normal, because as a psychopath, they are masters of impression management. That's why they make it onto corporate boards and ministry boards and church boards and become pastors.
Some of them become volunteers and coaches too, John, like Graham James
true.
here in
100%.
Canada.
That isn't that true? That's exactly right.
And I look at this chart, John, and John gave me the very rare privilege of including this chart, as well as he wrote a chapter for my book on the predators among us, damaged by the predators among us. And that chart, when I read it, I'm like, if only I could have seen that when I was 20 years old, because the far right depicted my first husband like he was the ultimate predator, threatened with death, threatened our children. And you know, when I look at that and think, and that's why I'm in this fight, it's what fuels my fire, because children are being preyed upon in our homes, in our schools, on our sports field, in our washrooms. Like it's just like it's all on steroids. So Linda, having you be able to understand some of this and bring with, couple that with your wealth of knowledge and what you have been addressing politically, this is really, really important. Anyways, John, sorry.
This is alarming to me. This is just so alarming to me.
Right, and it should be. What I want to tell every individual that is in a leadership position, in a policy-making position, if you allow men who think it's a reasonable proposition to dress in women's underwear and drag, or put on a female suit of any sort, unless you can guarantee through following him 24/7, accessing his items, his personal items, shaking down his cell, following him into his house, understanding what he accesses online, understanding where he's been through his phone's GPS, unless you can find out what he's been purchasing through his financial transaction and what's on his electronics, you don't know about this individual. So you don't know if the night before he was masturbating heavily to dark web porn, do you? And are you limiting the cell phone What is he doing with his cell phone, his camera cell phone, as he takes it into the women's locker room? Just ask the teammates of the deviant guy, Leah Thomas. Linda, we talked about him, and information has come out, which simply proves exactly what I predicted. Now, this chart, quickly going over it, it shows the downhill progressions. There's about 10 different levels. The blue represents the straight and narrow, somebody that is morally upright where they should be, has a conscience. They will begin to move downward in a stair-step-like fashion. Downward, they'll access porn. Their selfishness grows. They then, if they continue, they will become porn saturated. Of course they will, because they're accessing porn now on a regular basis. That's the concern with the SOGI sex ed stuff, the sexual orientation, gender identity stuff being pumped into schools. What's happening? They become callous and indifferent. That's why they can see a man putting their hand on a woman's throat or suggesting that people on the receiving end of anal benefit. Okay, now they'll become willful and purposeful. And that is the beginning of the deviance process, where it's no longer about ensuring that the partner is enjoying him or herself. What is it? Now it's about effect. That is how they're getting an erection. Then they become twisted and dark, morally inverted. Bestiality enters into the picture prior to the man entering into child rape porn or exploitation material. Inevitably, there will be bestiality accessed. And what do we think furries is? And pup play. Morally twisted. And that's why you see now in the gay pride parades, men marching with leather and whips and pups. Now they are given over. That term actually comes out of Romans chapter 1. It says God gave them over. That's a judicial term. It's very interesting. When the sheriff or bailiff takes the prisoner away, sentence has been, the gavel comes down, sentence has been passed. He says, take them away. The term given over means take them away. They're given over to a mind without brakes, and they will go down. This is the point of no return. I want people to understand that a psychopath's brain is different forever, and there's no rehabilitation. Why? Because he's lost the desire to be any other way than what he is, and he wants to become more of that. Eventually, then the next stage is what? Sadistic, and then malevolent. Malevolence is a deep-seated hatred, and that is what pornography does to men. And then I'm going to get out of this, and we're going to now access, speaking of accesses, we're going to look at what was found on Leah Thomas's, let me bring it up here very quickly, what was found behind the scenes. Linda, when you and I spoke last, we said, and I mentioned, this guy's deviant. He's dark. He's got a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, and he's traumatizing the women. The teammates complained about this guy. He's getting erections. He's staring at them, and they were told to shut up and sit down and stop being insensitive. And
by other women in leadership, even.
Oh, there you go. And I said, this guy's really deviant and dark. Any guy that wants access into a woman's private space, and I'll say it again. And if anybody wants to debate me, come on this program. That if you have a man that wants access into private space as a woman, you have a man that's doing so for a reason, and it can be a young man, it can be a high school student. So what happened was, lo and behold, somebody did a deep dive into Leah Thomas, the deviant guy in women's swimsuits, and found he had a fake Twitter account, probably more than one. And they started to investigate deviant Leah Thomas. And so we're going to now, this comes from Jake Crane on Twitter. And I'm going to scroll. As a matter of fact, we'll read part 2 here. I can't, my camera's in my way. Leah Thomas appears to have, there you go, 2 Instagram accounts. His public account, Leah Thomas, featuring a small handful of generic photos promoting messages like, let trans kids play, then a private Leah Thomas account. The question is, would somebody who's sexually deviant, would a man who's sexually deviant ever act immoral or unethically or lie to your face? Are you kidding me? They love to play good people for fools. So welcome to Leah Thomas's Facebook or Twitter pages. So let's see, we're going to bring these up here. There we go. Okay, so this was found, this is just the beginning of it. Oh, look at that. We have a cartoon that has a little girl, but it's a boy because last time I checked, boys don't have what? Don't have erections. Okay, and I'm going to bring...
Boys do. Boys do, though.
Boys have. I'm sorry. Girls don't. So
I thought you were...
what did I just say? Sorry, I'm trying to multitask here. Okay, this is straight. These are all from Leah Thomas's. Oh, look at this. We have a little sex doll, apparently. Or that's a girl. I'm not sure. I can't discern. But that looks like a minor, doesn't it?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to keep... There we go. Now, what's interesting, so people can go on, again, Jake Crane did an excellent job, but for purposes of time constraints, I'm scrolling, this is what I want to show people, because inevitably, sexual deviance does what? Produces malevolence toward women, not just power and control, but the desire to traumatize. Okay, Leah Thomas, what did this dude... prior to getting on the women's swim team, as it comes up here, we'll let it load here just for a moment. There we are. Now that looks wholesome, doesn't it? Okay, let me see if we can go to part 2. I don't know how to do it on this one. Okay, so let me get out of this because I want to, well, we'll have to do it one by one. So I'll be selective which ones just for interest of time.
So you're getting into bondage and...
Okay, well, that's right. We're already into BDSM here. Yeah. I want to show you... Oh, boy. Oh, okay. It's having to reload here. Well, I recommend going because I'm going to show you the most discerning. All these are concerning. Here we go.
Oh, that's dark.
You remember the mixed martial arts guy that then went on the women's team and beat the daylights out of female athletes, crushed their
Fallon
skulls.
Fox.
There we go. Leah Thomas apparently gave thumbs up. Now we're going to watch this picture. There we go. That's a woman that's had her skull crushed in.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Okay.
Yeah. So
now on his Facebook page, technologically though, unfortunately, I'm having, oh wait, maybe I can, okay, let's see if I can change it this way. Okay, that's slow. Okay, so there's another one. What does he say? Collapse of... Okay, this is him promoting himself. Let me... Bear with me, folks. Okay, so here's the screen. We're going to move it this way. I think we're going to see, again, that bloodied woman. And then here comes another picture. This is on Leah Thomas's own page. Here we go. There's another woman that obviously... is not in good shape. So we have a malevolence toward women. And here's another one on his page. And what should we find here?
Oh, of course.
I'm having a... Okay, there we are. Wanted for torture, conspiracy, aiding and abetting criminals. That is, we could say that's a subtle threat, not so subtle.
Not so subtle.
Okay, if you continue on to his, if you continue on that Twitter thread, let me see if I can scroll down just a few more here, and then we will get out of this. Okay, we're going to go. There's a lot of deviance, sexual deviance. There he is. How do we know he's a sexually deviant guy? Because he's posting all sorts of questionable things. We get into male deviant orgies, and then he claims to have had his testicles removed. He claims to be castrated, but I have now said publicly, I'll say it again, that Leah, unless I see for myself that you are now missing your testicles, I think you're a liar. Simple as that. And by the way, castration does not deal with deviance. That's why chemically castrating pedophiles will not work. That's why pedophiles use objects on children anyways. So my contention is this: by the time a man wants to access women's spaces, you notice they're not sensitive to those women. They are secretly loving, traumatizing those women. So to allow a man who dresses in women's underwear and drag and any kind of female sporting attire into the locker rooms, into the private spaces, you now have increased the likelihood of some degree of sexual assault, and that women will be traumatized. And you do not know the extent to which that XY male has been accessing very heinous porn the night before.
So they're not celebrating
John,
womanhood at all, are they, John?
I'm sorry, Brad?
They're not celebrating their womanhood at all, are they?
Oh, anything but.
Well, let me ask you this then. So, as sports administrator, I mean, what if somebody like this is in our midst? Like, what do we like if they haven't done anything overt yet? Like, what is the policy recommendation that you would have, or like the safeguardings that you would recommend based on your experience in this as a therapist for this kind of deviancy, John? I'm really interested because this really freaks me out, to be honest.
And it should.
It should.
I would say this should freak everyone out. I've worked with sex offenders for 14 years. I'm freaked out by the fact that anybody's going to allow this. Linda, you asked the right question, right? Because people say, well, these men haven't offended yet. I've had people say this, well, John, you work with a different cohort of population. Meaning what? Well, those guys have been in prison. Okay. And they were where the day before prison? And they were found out how? Did they give themselves up? Oh, you mean I work with the men that are finally busted out of the population of men that you're letting in women's private spaces? Oh, you mean those guys? And among other things, what again, are we anti any? No, because I work with plenty of men that were in churches. So the question is this, ultimately, are we taking a high bar approach toward protecting women and children or a low bar approach? Are you more concerned about the sensitivities of deviant men or the protection of women and children against the possibility, if not the likelihood, the inevitability of sexual assault? Which is more important to you? And for those of you that have regular access, as far as interacting with kids, you're a mandated reporter. And unless you can tell me the nine red flag key clinical indicators of sexual trauma and indications of sexual predation, then you're in no position to meaningfully discharge your duty as a mandated reporter. Therefore, you can't protect the kids. And unless you can list off for me the characteristic of a sexual predator, then you're placing the young people under your charge at risk, and you're opening the door for potentially very dangerous and deviant individuals.
Dr. Linda, does that make me think that I want to coach anymore?
Well, and
no, it scares me actually, but it makes me actually more determined than ever to try to find a solution to like logical safeguarding. Like how do we do, like what is like at the end of the day, and actually my devices are running out of battery. I noticed, but at the end of the day, what is the
okay, I'll tell you a couple of very practical things.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so what I would say is this: any XY chromosome male that wants to go into a female's team, that's going to permit them in a female private space. So first of all, one easy way of saying that any guy on a woman's team can't go in the locker room or shower. Zero. They have to have their own spaces. That's going to clear the vast majority of guys out anyways. Why? It's no fun that way. You think these guys really want the medals? No, those are preliminaries. They're in it so they can get in the private spaces. You eliminate that, so tell them they can't go into the locker rooms anymore. They have to have their own spaces. That'll eliminate the vast majority of them. Tell them they also, as long as they are going to enter into, this is all voluntary, sports is voluntary. If they're going to do that, they have to agree to, for the entire duration of time, beginning to end, even off season, they have to agree to a spontaneous forensic assessment of their electronics, their online activities, their financial transactions, and their phone's GPS 24/7 spontaneously at any point in time. They have to sign that. And what I will tell these guys is I'll sign that now. I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do, but I'm not interested in accessing and forcing my way into women and children's private spaces. Now, am I? So if they're above board, there shouldn't be any reason why they wouldn't want full disclosure now, would they? If they're legitimate. If they're legitimate, emphasize, if they are legitimate, they wouldn't have a hard time with 100% transparency. Now, would they? The third is create a third category of sports where only transgenders compete.
Right. Right.
So
That's what people say.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
that's true. That's
I
true.
just want
That's
to
true.
say something here, because I think for you, Linda, just thinking practically, number one, keeping these men and boys out of female spaces. That's number one. So,
And
we
no
need to
cell
do that.
phones, no cell phones.
Yeah, well, if they can, yeah, but let me go to the cell phone, because I think this is a harder hurdle, right, provincially, federally, to get something signed. But if we could legislate, you know, here's your electronic, you sign that you, like John says, you know, will
Most sports
release all.
organizations have a code of conduct already, and they have that implemented. My players all have to sign off on it. Us coaches have to sign off on it. So that's already kind of there, Dr. Ann. But, you know, there's got to be something else.
It has to be implemented, right? It has to be implemented by the coaches.
Well, who's protecting
and-
us coaches? I got to
that's
protect
it.
the trans.
Yeah.
I got to protect my athletes. I got to protect the trans athlete. I got to go over and above to protect the trans athlete or the girl in my boys' locker room. Yet who's protecting me?
Yeah,
I'm worried about what's going to
That's
happen
my
to me.
concern.
Yeah. And that's why people are so afraid to speak up, because we
Yeah.
are not protected by the law, nor our government, who actually wants to radicalize us and eliminate those who would speak up on these issues.
One
right?
accusation
It's-
destroys my reputation and destroys my coaching forever. Once. Just
Yeah.
once.
That's true.
And it's not even a criminal, it's not even a charge or anything else. It's an accusation. And that's all
Wow.
it takes. I'm ruined. And
Yeah.
Dr. Linda, you've
Linda, and
seen that
also,
before in
you know,
sport.
I've seen it before. I have.
Yeah.
In
And
all
yet-
sincerity, first of all, I think that's the answer. Now, the premise, somebody could say, you're singling these poor individuals out. No, you're asking for an exception.
Well,
And
they're
given the
singled
fact you
out.
have XY chromosomes, right? Here's the reality. What percentage of the male population is accessing porn these days? The vast majority. So we
Yes.
already know that males access porn at a massive rate. We do know that by the time somebody is dressing in women's underwear, they've accessed porn on a regular basis to a greater extent than not. How do we know? Because it's the reality in sex offending, and those men prior to sex offending were deeply steeped in porn. Porn underlies 100% of all sex offending, and there's that progression downward. So because men access porn on a fairly regular basis, the majority of them, 90 some odd percent, by the time somebody thinks it's a reasonable proposition to wear women's underwear, drag, and get into women's spaces, they have inevitably accessed more porn. Therefore, in order to assure safety, we have to raise the bar. If somebody, and again, this is voluntary. So if somebody voluntarily wants access onto a female team, then on behalf of ensuring the safety of fellow teammates, it is a reasonable proposition to have them go above and beyond to prove that they are legitimate. And taking those 4 steps, signing that law enforcement at any point in time, just like there are those remote computer help, like computer buddy or geek buddy or whatever, right? And if I'm stuck, I can actually give them permission to go into my computer and take over the mouse. And it's a beautiful thing. Why? Because they know what they're doing and I don't. So they go in and they clear this and they do that. It's a beautiful thing to watch somebody else in my computer. Okay, because I have nothing to hide. So if I have nothing to hide, I say, come on in. If that's what enables me to be able then, if it's that important to me to invade a woman's private space, then I should prove that I am 100% safe and not accessing any pornography. And therefore, at any point in time, law enforcement forensically can access without notice once that is signed. So 24/7. Actually, everybody will be better off anyways, because that'll keep them on the straight and narrow anyways.
Well, and the reality, given your charts, John, is that these individuals are already in the deviant stage.
That's right. Look at Leah Thomas.
It's not if they're going to get there. They are already there. And this is the saddest thing for young boys because, and this goes way back, so here we are, Linda. How do we get there? Goes way back to Freud and Kinsey particularly, who legislated academically, so to speak, deviancy, sexual deviancy. And so that's been coming down the pike. And the things that your children, the sexual continuum that your children learn in kindergarten, that's from Kinsey, 1948. So this has been going on. This has been going on. So we're just seeing the ramifications. And he was into all kinds of perversions, and his associates were into bestiality. The whole thing. So there was so much deviancy way back then. It hasn't done nothing but escalate. It's gone all through the roof. And our children, our boys and girls, have been the targets for decades. And now, how do we save them?
Now it's supercharged on the internet. And so what I have found very helpful is to understand what you've said here today, Jon. And really, it's given me sobering information. I need to really process this. I am going to have to depart pretty soon because I have like about 3% left of battery, and I apologize for cutting it off.
It's perfect timing, Linda. We're wrapping things up.
I wish we could talk longer. There's more to learn, but it's kind of like it's an unfortunate thing to have to learn about. But I think it's sobering, and it's something that as a sports leader, and I think, Brad, you would agree, it's very important that we are at least aware of these this side of life that maybe we haven't considered and how it's sort of going into sport.
That's right. And I would say,
we definitely have to pay attention to this going forward. We definitely have to do our due diligence to stop this from entering our dressing rooms and our locker rooms. And to do that, it's going to take individuals such as yourself. We're going to have to ask for the help that you've asked for here today. And I commend you, Dr. Linda, for stepping up. I know that Albertans, very progressive, but a progressive in a conservative way. Okay? And that conservatism is going to lead you to be in a very good place to be a great leader in this venture going forward for all Canadians. And I want you to know that as a coach, I see that in you, and I'm counting on you to be that voice for us. And I want you to also know that if you need help, I'm happy to come anywhere. Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Ottawa. I'll be there by your side to stand up with you, Doctor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. I really, and everybody today, Ann and Jon, thank you. This is a resource, all of you, very valuable resource for me. And I'm not stopping this fight. I am committed to the safety and preservation of sport. So we're going to keep going. And thank you for having me.
Linda, thank you. It's been eye-opening for all of us. And it really is a sobering topic to think that this is placing women and children in harm's way. At the end of the day, it not only is unfair to women and children, but is placing them in harm's way. Dr. Ann Gillies, thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Linda, thank you.
Thank you.
Brad, thank you as always.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement with Jon Uhler. Remember, this isn't your kids' fight. This is our fight. We have to stand up on behalf of our children. Take initiative. Get online to our website at unmaskingthetransmovement.com. You'll find all kinds of resourceful information there. All of our videos are there. You'll get tips on how you can actually look at other individuals such as Pierre Barnes's information, who's got documents that are ready to be sent to school boards, ministers of education, ministers of sport as well. Thank you very much for being here today, all of you, and we'll see you again soon. All right, we are out.
Linda, we did it.
That
Yay!